Anatahan Island lies approximately 177 kilometers north of Saipan. This small island is part of the Mariana Islands in the Pacific Ocean. During World War II, 32 men and 1 Japanese woman were stranded on this isolated island for 6 years. They possessed 2 guns and had 1 woman among them. Over time, a series of bizarre events unfolded on the island, leading to the deaths of many. In the end, the woman was the sole survivor, while the number of men dwindled to just 19. So, what really happened on this desolate island? You're about to dive into the story of the Anatahan Island Massacre, a tale of 1 woman living on an isolated island with 32 men. And as always, before we get into the details, don't forget to hit like and subscribe to support us, as well as to stay updated on more thrilling and intriguing cases. In 1939, encouraged by domestic policies, many Japanese citizens migrated to the islands occupied by Japan to work and settle there. Kazuko Higa, just 16 years old at the time, was one of them. She embarked on a long journey from Okinawa, Japan, to the island of Saipan, seeking shelter with her brother. Before long, she found work as a waitress in a cafe. Kazuko, youthful and beautiful, quickly gained admiration from many men. Among them was Shoichi Higa, a young man also from Okinawa. Shoichi successfully courted Kazuko, and after some time dating, the two were married when Kazuko turned 18. Due to Japan's limited land area, the Japanese government implemented policies to promote migration and colonization of various Pacific islands. Shoichi, Kazuko's husband, worked as a supervisor overseeing laborers on these islands. After their marriage, Kazuko and Shoichi enjoyed a happy life together. In 1944, Shoichi's work responsibilities changed when he was reassigned to Anatahan Island. He brought his wife Kazuko along with him. They were accompanied by Kikichiro Higa, the overseer of the plantation on the island. Anatahan is a small island in the Mariana Islands, located about 177 kilometers north of Saipan. The island is oval-shaped, about 9 kilometers long and 3.7 kilometers wide, covering an area of nearly 32 square kilometers. Anatahan Island is home to a volcano that rises approximately 790 meters above sea level. The island also once boasted vast coconut plantations, which were highly productive until they were devastated by storms, leading to their decline. By the time Shoichi and Kazuko arrived, only about 20 local laborers remained on the island, and Shoichi's job was to manage and oversee their work. Shortly after their arrival, World War II began to draw to a close. Japan faced significant defeats on the Pacific Front, suffering devastating losses. Many of the islands initially occupied by Japan were gradually reclaimed by American forces. During this time, Shoichi grew concerned for his sister, who was still living on a nearby island. Worried about her safety, he decided to leave Anatahan to visit her. Tragically, he never returned, and no one knew what became of him. At this point, only a few local inhabitants remained on Anatahan Island. Among the Japanese, only Kazuko and Shoichi's boss, Kikichiro, were left. Under the harsh circumstances, the two grew close and eventually began living together as a couple. Unfortunately, the peace on Anatahan Island did not last. Not long after, the island was bombed by American forces. Kazuko and Kikichiro fled into the dense jungle at the island's center and managed to survive. However, the bombing completely destroyed the island's plantations, along with nearly all daily supplies and necessities. They lost all contact with the outside world, and Anatahan effectively became a completely isolated island. Fortunately, the 40 pigs and 20 chickens they had been raising survived the attack. These animals became their primary means of sustenance. With careful management, they could maintain a peaceful existence. However, their secluded world was short-lived, as an unexpected event disrupted their fragile stability. On June 12, 1944, 4 fishing vessels were attacked by American forces near Anatahan Island. 3 of the ships sank to the ocean floor, while the 4th was heavily damaged and sank shortly after. Many crew members perished, but one of the ships sank close enough to Anatahan for survivors to attempt swimming toward the island. In the end, 31 men managed to make it to the shore. Among them were 10 Japanese Navy personnel and 21 civilian sailors. All of them were young men, with the youngest being just 16 years old. With no boats left, the survivors had no way to leave the island. They could only make do on Anatahan, relying on wild bananas and coconuts to stave off hunger. At first, the 31 men thought the island was uninhabited, completely isolated from the outside world. However, during one of their outings to gather wild fruits, they unexpectedly encountered Kazuko and Kikuichiro. The two had been living alone in their isolated world for a long time. Seeing so many people arrive at once, they were overjoyed. After all, aside from Kazuko and Kikuichiro, who were Japanese, everyone else on the island had been local inhabitants, making communication challenging. The arrival of fellow countrymen brought a sense of familiarity, and the make-believe couple, Kazuko and Kikuichiro, enthusiastically helped the newcomers. Kikuichiro not only shared food with them, but also treated their injuries. Initially, the 31 survivors formed small groups to live in different parts of the island. Over time, however, they became more accustomed to each other and began living together, including Kazuko and Kikuichiro. As the number of people grew, the issue of food and clothing became urgent. Before long, they had eaten all the pigs and chickens on the island. Their remaining food supply consisted of wild fruits, crabs, and some seafood. They started fishing near the shore to prevent starvation. Once they secured enough food, they even learned how to make coconut wine to enjoy life in a way that felt instinctively human. Food was no longer an immediate concern, but clothing became a problem. Initially, they had clothes, but over time, they wore out and became tattered. They had to use bark and other primitive materials to cover themselves. Living this way, the 33 people on the island managed to maintain a peaceful existence for over a year. On August 15, 1945, Japan was completely defeated and officially surrendered. However, the people living on the island were unaware of this event. Later, the American military broadcasted the news of Japan's surrender to those still on the island. Despite this, they refused to believe it, thinking it was a trap set by the Americans, and steadfastly declined to leave the island. Over time, the local inhabitants gradually left the island, leaving only 33 Japanese individuals completely isolated from the rest of the world. It was at this point that their seemingly peaceful life began to change. The extreme imbalance in the male-to-female ratio caused many of the men to view Kazuko differently. After all, they were young men full of vitality. The unusual atmosphere grew increasingly tense, and it became clear that if something wasn't done, chaos would surely erupt. To address the situation, some of the smarter and kinder men proposed that Kazuko and Kikuichiro hold a wedding. The ceremony was conducted in front of everyone, with the aim of showing that Kazuko was now spoken for and discouraging further attention toward her. After the wedding, Kazuko and Kikuichiro distanced themselves from the group and lived independently. This strategy worked, and life on the island returned to a semblance of peace, as hoped. However, this peace did not last long. In August 1946, the wreckage of an American bomber was discovered on the island. Among the debris were numerous household items, including parachutes that could be repurposed as clothing, and more notably, 4 broken pistols and 90 rounds of ammunition. Some of the men on the island had military experience and knew how to handle firearms. Eventually, 2 of the broken pistols were repaired, changing the dynamics on the island once again. Equality was no longer part of life on the island. In this isolated world, whoever possessed a gun held the power. Guns became symbols of authority, and those with authority could dictate the lives of others. The arrival of 2 working pistols drastically altered the fate of the 33 people on the island. First, the 2 men who repaired the guns, known here as Yamamoto and Yamaguchi, immediately became the rulers of the group. As the ones in charge, they sought to claim the best for themselves. What they desired most on the island, without question, was Kazuko Higa. Yamamoto and Yamaguchi used their weapons to force Kazuko and her husband into submission. Under the pressure of their dominance, Kazuko had no choice but to silently endure. However, things were far from simple. Not long after, the island witnessed its first mysterious death. A man fell from a coconut tree and died. Yamamoto and Yamaguchi were the only witnesses. Coincidentally, this man had previously had disputes with Yamamoto and others. This led the rest of the group to suspect that his death might be linked to Yamamoto and Yamaguchi. the growing suspicions made those without weapons increasingly anxious about their own safety. Yamamoto, however, remained unfazed and only grew more arrogant. When another man attempted to assault Kazuko, Yamamoto and Yamaguchi shot him dead. This act sent waves of fear through the group, as everyone began to worry that they might be the next target. At this point, the focus shifted away from Kazuko and toward the two pistols. The atmosphere on the island grew heavy with tension and fear. If anyone on the island was the most terrified at this time, it was undoubtedly Kazuko's husband, Kikuichiro. He lived under the constant watch of Yamamoto and Yamaguchi, fearing that one day, if he displeased them, they would kill him. Desperate to save himself, Kikuichiro devised a plan. He approached Yamamoto and Yamaguchi, telling them that he no longer wished to live with Kazuko and would leave her to them. Delighted by this, the two praised Kikuichiro for being clever, unaware that this was all part of his scheme. There is a saying, "An outsider sees things more clearly." In this situation, Kazuko, as if watching from the outside, could see what was coming. Previously, Yamamoto and Yamaguchi, both armed, had been united in suppressing others. But now, with both of them vying for Kazuko without a third party to mediate, their instincts as humans would inevitably drive them to want her for themselves. This would create tension between them, and one day, they were bound to turn on each other. Sure enough, it wasn't long before Yamamoto and Yamaguchi fiercely clashed over Kazuko. After a brutal fight, Yamaguchi emerged victorious. With this victory, Yamaguchi not only claimed the sole woman on the island, but also gained possession of both pistols, solidifying his control and power. This left everyone else on the island feeling frustrated and resentful. When the dominance of the powerful becomes too apparent, it is only natural for the weaker to start plotting rebellion. Yamaguchi, however, believed that his days of happiness had finally arrived. He thought he could rule the island as its king. But it wasn't long before Yamaguchi suddenly died. Officially, it was said that he fell into the sea and drowned. However, everyone on the island knew the real reason behind his death, though no one dared to speak it aloud. And so, the two pistols that had belonged to Yamaguchi fell into the hands of two new men, Nakazawa and Iwai. They, too, immediately seized control of Kazuko, forcing her to serve both of them. The scene was all too familiar. Two armed men taking possession of Kazuko, just as Yamaguchi and Yamamoto had done before. And just like before, it was clear that this would not end well. Those observing from the outside could see the pattern repeating itself. However, those caught in the middle seemed blind to it. The fragile peace on the island lasted just over a month before conflict arose once more. This time it was Nakazawa and Iwai who clashed. After another fierce battle, Iwai emerged victorious. Once again, the two pistols on the island came under the control of a single person. As before, Iwai took sole possession of Kazuko. The situation mirrored the past, but Iwai had learned from the mistakes of his predecessors. He became extremely cautious and meticulous in his daily life, constantly fearing that someone might try to kill him. For 2 years, Iwai managed to maintain his position without incident. However, fate seemed to have other plans. 2 years later, one day, Iwai was assassinated. In the years that followed, the shadow of death continued to loom over Anatahan Island. 3 more people died under mysterious circumstances, described officially as accidents. By then, a total of 9 people had lost their lives. Though no one openly spoke about it, everyone on the island silently understood that these deaths were most likely caused by the presence of the guns. So, the remaining survivors decided to sit down and discuss a solution to their problems. After much conversation and sharing, they concluded that the 2 pistols were the main cause of the chaos. To put an end to the fear and tension, they came up with a plan. Kazuko would choose one man to marry, and the 2 pistols would be thrown into the sea. With no weapons symbolizing power, and Kazuko being claimed, there would no longer be any reason for conflict. It seemed like a reasonable plan, didn't it? And so, everyone agreed and followed through. But did this really solve the underlying problem? In reality, the answer was no. In the days that followed, there were still 4 mysterious deaths and disappearances on the island. The pistols had clearly been thrown into the sea, so why were people still dying? At this point, everyone on the island became deeply worried about their own safety. In just 5 short years, the original group of 32 men had dwindled to only 19. To address the situation, the remaining survivors were forced to hold another meeting. This time, their discussions revealed the root cause to be greed. While the pistols symbolizing power were gone, the greed for control over the only woman on the island persisted. This, they believed, was what continued to fuel the chaos. Finally, they came to a drastic decision. Kazuko had to be eliminated. They believed that only by doing this could they eliminate their desires and restore peace to the island. After reaching a consensus, they planned to carry out the decision the following day. That night, however, a man who deeply loved Kazuko revealed the plan to her. Upon hearing the news, Kazuko was overcome with fear and spent the entire night finding a way to hide in the jungle. Using her survival instincts, she managed to live day by day in the crevices of the island's mountainous terrain. With an area of nearly 32 square kilometers covered in dense jungle, it wasn't easy for the men to locate Kazuko in a short amount of time. In June 1950, on the 33rd day of her escape, Kazuko unexpectedly spotted an American warship anchored off the coast. Kazuko immediately climbed a tree, removed her clothing, and began waving and shouting loudly. Her actions caught the attention of the American military, and she was rescued. At last, Kazuko survived and escaped the grim island. After hearing Kazuko's detailed account, the U.S. military informed the other Japanese men on the island that the war had ended. However, they refused to believe it, suspecting it was a trap, and declined to leave. Kazuko then returned to Japan and reported that survivors were still living on the island. She also informed the families of those who remained there. In response, the families began writing letters to inform their loved ones that the war was indeed over and that they could safely return home. Over 200 letters were sent to the island, but the men there still insisted it was a trap set by the American military. They continued to refuse to leave. However, on June 26, 1951, one man on the island became convinced that the letter he received had been written by his wife's unmistakable hand. Trusting the truth of the message, he persuaded the others to accept the reality that they had been defeated. Eventually, they agreed to surrender to the U.S. military. The survivors were rescued from the island and taken to a U.S. military base in Guam before being repatriated to Japan. Having been missing for so many years, most people had assumed they had died in the war. When they returned, many of their wives had remarried. Even Kazuko's former husband, Shoichi Higa, had moved on and was happily remarried. When the media questioned the survivors about the fate of the 13 men who did not return, their accounts were inconsistent, raising suspicions. The truth was only revealed when one of the survivors, under immense pressure, could no longer keep it hidden. It was eventually reported by the media that the missing men had died in a series of violent clashes over the only woman on the island. This revelation thrust Kazuko Higa into the spotlight, making her a controversial figure in Japanese society. The media gave her many sensational nicknames, such as the Queen of Anatahan, the Woman with 32 Faces, the Queen Bee, and the Woman Who Enchanted Men. While some outlets expressed sympathy for Kazuko, acknowledging that she had no choice but to endure humiliation in such circumstances, the majority vilified her and placed the blame on her actions. Kazuko's story became a controversial topic in Japanese society at the time. Later, she was invited to play the lead role in the stage play, The Island of Anatahan. Starting in 1952, Kazuko toured the country for 2 years. In 1953, the events on Anatahan Island were adapted into a film titled The Truth About Anatahan Island. The movie depicted part of Kazuko Higa's true story, and she portrayed herself in the film. Kazuko's acting career lasted a few years, but she was unable to continue down that path. Eventually, to make a living, she became a dancer in Tokyo. At the age of 34, Kazuko remarried. Together with her new husband, she opened a small shop and began a simple new life. However, her happiness was short-lived, as she lost her husband when she was just 40 years old. In March 1974, Kazuko passed away from a brain tumor at the age of 50. Her tumultuous life came to an end. The tragedy on Anatahan Island, though confined to a small, remote place, reflected broader issues inherent in human society. When morality is no longer bound by rules, the primal struggle for survival re-emerges. Driven by the pressures of a shared environment, the balance between the human and animalistic sides of individuals becomes hard to determine. In such a scenario, only the victors have the privilege to speak. At that time, competition on the island was driven by strength. Those who possessed guns held power. Today, struggles have shifted from physical strength to wealth and beauty. A line from a novel aptly captures this idea. Fish that climb onto land are no longer fish. The people on Anatahan Island had been isolated from the norms of human society. Perhaps in such circumstances they could no longer be called human in the truest sense of the word. Some believe that the tragedy on Anatahan Island was caused by the presence of 2 guns and the only woman on the island. However, this isn't entirely true. The guns were merely a spark. The true cause lay in human desire. Human nature often struggles to endure temptation. The presence of the lone woman and the guns acted as catalysts, accelerating the inevitable conflicts. Afterward, the island's residents blamed Kazuko, accusing her of bringing death and horror to the island. Some even planned to harm her. But did they ever consider that if each person had controlled their desires, the outcome might have been different? Kazuko clearly deserves sympathy. Following these events, some media outlets continued to criticize her, despite the fact that she was a vulnerable individual caught in a cycle of violence and power. She had no choice but to endure and comply. Some have questioned why Kazuko never became pregnant during her years on the island. Various articles have explored this topic, but no definitive explanation has been found. It's possible she experienced an unintended pregnancy that ended in miscarriage, resulting in infertility. After returning to Japan, Kazuko worked various jobs to make a living. Despite her efforts to move forward, she remained a widely discussed figure in the media, though much of the coverage was negative. Faced with this reality, could she have had any other choice but to endure? This story highlights the darker aspects of human nature. It is for this reason that rules and laws were created, not only to protect vulnerable groups, but more importantly, to maintain balance within society. What about you? What are your thoughts on the events of Anatahan Island? And what do you think about Kazuko? Did she truly deserve such harsh criticism? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and let's discuss. Before you go, don't forget to hit like, subscribe, and turn on notifications to stay updated on more fascinating true crime cases.